So Jean-Paul Sartre, he's the first person I'm starting with in this sort of lecture series I've conceived called The Lives and Thought of the Philosophers, where I aim to dig into biographical aspects of a thinker's life and then to assess some sort of philosophical concept that they've developed. And my belief is that that will give listeners a context for the time that the thinker is thinking and writing, and of course give everyone the opportunity to dive into an aspect of a thinker's thought and really see what they're all about. So I'm gonna start with about 30 minutes of Sartre's life. However, he's extremely well covered by people far better than me and that have done far better than I could hope to achieve in 30 minutes. So I wanted to immediately kind of change my approach and look at his literary life. So how does his life develop over time as a writer? That hasn't quite been done yet in a public forum like this. So that's what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to spend 30 minutes looking at his concept of bad faith, which he developed in Being and Nothingness. So Sartre's literary history really starts at the age of about 8 or 9. Picture him, he's spread out on his grandfather's ornamental rug in his grandfather's study. And he's surrounded by an extensive library. And this evidences a few things already. He's from the bourgeoisie class, which means middle class, fortunate, educated. These are high values, art, reading, culture, high values in the bourgeoisie class. His grandfather is a professor at the Sorbonne, and as such has an extensive library of about over 1,000 volumes, give or take. And this is fortunate for Sartre. Libraries like this are still treasures. It's not, information isn't quite as accessible as it is today, particularly libraries. I think that libraries back in the day, you probably couldn't lend out texts as easily as you can. And texts were, very precious back then. So he's spread out on this carpet, and he's surrounded by just about any great French thinker that you can imagine. Think like Tocqueville, Hugo, Voltaire, Rousseau, everyone. And he's, engaged with these writers and thinkers and dabbling. I mean, he's absorbing everything. Maybe not in depth but as much as he possibly can at 8 or 9. And he quickly gets into his head, I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to join this tradition. This is my calling, however you want to put it. I'm going to be a French writer. And he immediately jumps into this dialogue of this like wonderful French tradition of intellectualism. And he sees these people as, not above him, but colleagues. And he's determined to join this great conversation. He starts writing immediately around this age what he calls sort of like cloak and dagger stories. And they're essentially, children's stories. And they're not of much consequence for what we're looking at, but he's already beginning to write. So that's where Sartre, the writer, is born in his grandfather's library. So fast forward, he finally enters the rigorous French educational system, and he does well. He's clearly gifted, clearly intelligent. And after class one day, a professor comes up to him and suggests, why don't you read this philosophy text, Time and Free Will by Henry Bergson? And Sartre does, and mind too that unlike in America, philosophy, I think still to this day, across many places in Europe, philosophy is encountered, it's taught. So this isn't his sudden introduction to philosophy, but he reads this text and it sort of blows him away. He finds specifically a method and a language for discussing his own personal psychological experience of time. And this becomes extremely important because it gives him a method for analyzing himself as a coming writer, which is, especially at his age, he's fascinated with. And it also gives him the tools to continue building the sort of fictional worlds that he's envisioning. And mind you, too, at this point, still, he doesn't conceive of himself as a coming philosopher. He wants to write fiction. But this text is seminal. So he reads it and, continues to work on writing and all that, finishes school. Fast forward a little bit, he finishes college. We'll say it's a little different in France, but the educational system's, I'm not super versed in it. But he goes to top-notch schools. He's definitely he's really well educated. So anyways, he's appointed to a professorship, well, not a professorship, but I believe a boys' school in Le Havre, and he begins to teach these boys, and is still trying to make it through as a writer. One day, he's at a cafe, a bar, with his partner, Simone de Beauvoir, and a friend, an old schoolmate, I believe his name's Raymond Aron. And Aaron has just gotten back from Berlin. And they're sitting there drinking, smoking, having fun, talking. And Aaron says, Sartre, German philosophy, Husserl specifically, gives you sort of tools you need to discuss the experience of drinking this beer. It allows you to talk about this glass of beer. And whatever's said at this point, this sends Sartre's mind reeling, because his sort of worldview is very concrete. He wants to talk, specifically as a fiction writer, he wants to talk about what's happening here and now, what he sees, what he's engaged with. And he's just elated at this point. I mean, he's elated. After the talk, Beauvoir writes in her autobiography that he immediately went to a bookstore and picked up the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas's book on Husserl. And he immediately starts flipping through the pages. He hasn't even cut it. I mean, he's just engrossed with this. And of course, he ends up applying to go to Berlin at his friend's suggestion. Why don't you just go to Berlin and study for a year? So they do, Aaron and Sartre do a switcheroo. Aaron takes his position at Le Havre, and Sartre goes to Berlin. So this is 1933. Sartre's probably about 29 years old, give or take. Probably a little younger. I should probably do my math on that. He was born in 1905. Anyways, he goes to Berlin for a year, has a nice apartment, and he studies Husserl in German. And you would think that so he's in Germany, he's in Berlin, and Germany it's in quite a state right now. They're very bitter. The country's very bitter. They're sort of wounded from their treatment in World War I. Long story short, there's a lot of political conflict, a lot going on in Germany at this time, and none of this touches Sartre. He spends his time. He writes all day. He studies Husserl. Probably about from like 9 to 2. Takes the classic 2-hour French lunch break, a little bit more studying of philosophy. Then he spends his evenings either with friends at bars or working specifically on his first novel, which he will later publish many years later, Nausea. He's completely unaffected by what's going on. And anyone familiar with Sartre, this should strike you as odd. His later life is extremely politically active, but at this point, it doesn't touch him at all. So he comes back, takes up his teaching post again, Another 4 years rolls on. No success as a writer. He's tried to send his text, even with good appointments from or suggestions from friends, to like I believe like Gallimard, but no success as a writer. And he's dismayed. He kind of has this quote floating in his head that a writer, I believe, said that if you don't make it by your 20s, you're not going to make it as an intellectual in France. And he's pretty frustrated by this. But about 39, he finally succeeds in publishing his first novel. Already, he's published a couple philosophy texts, small things, probably more like the philosophy of psychology, so the transcendence of the ego, the imaginary. He spent a lot of time working on how we imagine things, images, imaginary thinking, make-believe. And he does this, of course, because he's interested in that in relation to fiction. He's not a philosopher yet. So he meets with success. He kind of finally makes it as a writer. He sort of achieves his dream. And then, of course, being 38, 39, big problem, World War II starts. Germany is, up in arms against England. They begin to invade Poland. And the French government, the French country, sets up, I believe it's called the Maginot Line. So it's a defense line along the northern perimeter of France. And because Sartre's French and because he's male, he has immediate duty to his country to serve. So, he's sort of made this dream, and then, of course, he's drafted. And he has to find his Massey bag in some dusty hotel that he's living in Paris, boards a train, Beauvoir walks him down to the train, boards a train about 2 a.m. and is sent off to the front. This might seem to spell the end of this dream for Sartre, but he, as cheeky as this sounds, he absolutely loves the next period of his life. He's out on the front in what the French come to call the phony war. So France is not interested in attacking Germany. They're not going to take any sort of offensive against Germany. They're essentially saying, hey, we don't like what you're doing, but don't come this way. We're not going to come after you, but don't come this way. They're war weary. All of Europe is war weary after World War I. World War I was insane. No one's super interested in joining Hitler down the war line. So Sartre spends his days, as he's in a meteorological unit. He sends up periodically throughout the day, he'll send up his teammates of like about 4 or 5. He'll send up an air balloon. He checks it through a spyglass and gets readings on the wind. That's his task in the war, which I think is hysterical. But that's what he ends up doing. Other than that, he's reading prodigiously. He's got a huge correspondence between his friends and lovers. He's writing a second novel, The Age of Reason, which is the first in the 3-part series, Roads to Freedom. And he's keeping a journal with the intent of capturing his experience as being at war. He's using Heideggerian terms. What is this being at war? What does it mean to be mobilized, to be a soldier, to have a world sort of shift all around you? And he tracks that. This text, these books are later assimilated and published after his death, and I want to put a plug in here for them. They're called the War Diaries. I think they're an excellent start for anyone that hasn't really dived into his thought. Existentialism as a humanism is often kind of picked up by people. I think this text is better. It gives you an excellent purview of his literary prowess. So when he discusses his encounters with his soldier mates, they're hysterical. These anecdotes, they're hysterical, well written. The dialogue is crisp, and this is his private journal. I mean, following him through this document is his mental acrobatics it's astounding. It's a pleasure to read. And just when you're about bored with that, he'll shift to like self-analysis. He'll start talking critically about himself. He criticizes himself for gaining weight. He talks about how he's going to diet. He talks about money, how he doesn't like to own things because he feels that it's sort of the world trapping his freedom. And then he'll shift to philosophy. And he starts to discuss his coming theories on nothingness, which will, by 1943 is published as Being and Nothingness. So this ends up being an excellent way for anyone that is interested in reading Sartre. Pick up the War Diaries, because it's essentially a self-curated masterpiece of his sort of purview of his thought, if you will. Anyways, to continue on, he does this for a while, shifting between countries on the front line, until, of course, the Germans they've had enough, and they're like, we're gonna conquer France, and they initiate their famous blitzkrieg and just plow through the French defense line, and Sartre is taken prisoner. And he's put in a prisoner of war camp located in France, and of course ran by the Germans. And again, oddly, he seems to love this. His life is stripped down to bare essentials. And he's surrounded by a milieu of people that he would have never encountered typically in his own life. As a bourgeoisie writer, he's a teacher, right? Now he's surrounded by everyone from farm workers, professors, mine workers, anyone, imagine it. Anyone that got conscripted, which was damn near every male in the French citizenship, and he's with all of them. Those are his comrades now. And he loves it. He loves the exposure. And he spends his time, again, reading when you can smuggle a book in, and basically daydreaming. He gets a job in the camp with one of the head priests, a German. And the German priest quickly realizes this guy's kind of a genius, and he wants to talk philosophy with him. They smuggle in a copy of Being and Time by Heidegger, and they debate for about 2 hours every morning. Sartre's day starts with a lesson and a debate with this priest about German philosophy, which again I think is hysterical, because I don't know. I just think that's so funny. So that's what he does. He ends up in the arts division of the prisoners, and is also assigned to write a Christmas play, and writes a very thinly veiled Greek play on oppression and how in resisting oppression, specifically speaking to all the other prisoners, his fellow prisoners who are in the crowd. But eventually he has to leave this context, and he gets forged documents about his health. He's I don't think the term is strabismus, but he's got a bad eye. It goes off to the left. The politically incorrect term is wall-eyed. He can't see very well. Anyways, they fudge some sort of document, and he escapes, and he kind of trots into Paris unannounced, and suddenly Sartre is changed. He's very different. He's not the Sartre that we knew in Berlin. Suddenly, he's deeply affected by the political world. He cites this as a period where he finally sort of wakes up. And this is where the Sartre that we know really develops. So 1943, he publishes Being and Nothingness, which is a massive tome on his view of man ontologically. It's a phenomenological text. It takes that approach, and it really starts to, that really is, this period is what establishes him as a French intellectual. So existentialism becomes extremely popular in the 40s, mid to late 40s. He gives his famous speech on existentialism as a humanism, and he suddenly becomes extremely engaged, like takes on head on the sort of intellectual political happenings in war-torn France and in post-war France. And like I said, this is the most prominent Sartre. This is the Sartre that most people know. So he's at this point he's famous. And a quick note on sort of fame in France. France. In America, we have, our superstars, our famous people are the rich, right? Anyone that has a lot of money, we give them a lot of prestige, and movie stars. In France, and I still think this is probably the case today, intelligence, broadly speaking, but intellectualism is that you're a superstar if you're I can't think of the word. If you're an intellectual, sorry. And that's Sartre. He's also rolling out tons of plays. They do great in the theater. He's top cheddar at this point. So he leaves. Being in nothingness it's a phenomenological text. It's an ontological text, but he concludes it with a sort of loose promise of an ethics to follow, an existentialist ethics. And of course, this is high on his mind because everything that's happening day in, day out in his world is morally charged, right? So this is post-war France. There's a lot of political questions in the air. How are we going to move forward after what happened? What do we do with this? And he begins to develop this existentialist ethics, but he never publishes it. What we get after his death is Notebooks for an Ethics, and a little volume, which we're going to look at today, called Truth and Existence. And this is all we have published from his sort of formal ethical project. But he abandons it. And the reason why is because he shifts approaches as a writer. He's no longer interested in what he criticizes as his bourgeoisie approach to writing. He wants to be what he calls an engaged writer, engaged writing. And what that means is that because he argues that writing is the free, engaged expression of an individual, he can use this as an avenue to advocate and to fight for what he believes is right. And he criticizes this ethical project, which he abandons about 48, we'll say. He abandons. And he abandons because he says this is a writer's ethics. This is sort of detached. This has no bearing on what's happening in Europe right now. This is, I guess, what we'd call today privileged ethics. This has no bearing on what's going on, and he abandons it. This doesn't mean that he abandons the ethical life by any stretch of the imagination. He has a very strict and focused moral outlook, and he lives this. He lived it his whole life, but he particularly lives it now to the end of his days when he passes away in 1980. So then we move on to Sartre's later life, sort of later period. And it's one that it's a lot more dense, let's put it that way. He's extremely engaged in European politics. He's grappling with these big questions that many intellectuals are grappling with at this time. What sort of political program are we going to adopt here? We've got Marxism, we've got Western democracy and capitalism, which they sort of immediately poo-poo. They've got Russia, China, socialism, communism, and the intellectual field becomes all about navigating this. Of course, too, in the 60s, the newer generations, which sort of were privileged enough, if you will, to adopt this mayhem, they start to have problems with what's going on. And Sartre's he's always contemporary. He's always rolling with the times and trying to change and think about the present. So that's Sartre now, and he's all over the place. Specifically, though, he as an engaged writer, he's writing on topics that are extremely prevalent, I think, today. So concretely here, he goes to America, and the first thing he realizes is the oppression of Black people and the working class in America. Goes back to France, immediately writes on it. He takes up what in the French it's called. The text is anti-Semite Jew. It's the Jewish question in French. He writes on the conditions of Jews and anti-Semitism in Europe. He writes on, France at this time, a big colonial force, writes on anti-colonialism, specifically in Algeria, when the Algerian War breaks out in the second half of the 20th century. He's vehemently opposed to the colonization of Algeria. So he applies himself to concrete historical moments and takes them full on. At the same time as well, he pretty much bites wholesale into Marxism, and he develops a way to meld existentialism into Marxism. And this text that we have is The Critique of Dialectical Reason, another massive philosophical tome that he publishes. And his project in this text is to sort of find a description of man that satisfies his existentialist bent, while also sort of lauding and purifying a Marxist understanding of society. And then later, he spends the remainder of his life, or a good portion of his later life, on an extensive study of the writer Gustave Flaubert, called The Family Idiot. And in this text, he specifically takes up this question, right, which he writes in the first volume prologue: how much can we know about man? Later in his life, he receives a little criticism for this. He's quite old, 70s, and he's somehow still stayed extremely current in his time, given his age. But people, younger intellectuals, so at this time, we have Foucault and all them, they kind of criticize him, Sartre's hiding away in his Flaubert. Not necessarily the case, but I do want to stress that the Family Idiot it's a wonderful text. It's a huge one, but it still has absolute prevalence to his sort of philosophical political project. It's sprawling. At this point, he doesn't believe that a real writer should edit themselves. It should just be sort of this free burgeoning forth of thought. So he's an excellent writer, so he can more or less get away with this, but they're big volumes. But in him, he's absolutely concerned with a phenomenological approach of understanding what it means to be human. What can we know about Flaubert? And he tries to exhaust the realm of knowledge when it comes to knowing Flaubert as another individual. So that pretty much rounds him out. In 1980, he ends up passing away, and it's a huge event. I think over 50,000 people in France attend. And yeah, it's monumental. And he leaves behind a long literary tradition collection that really evidences that he has succeeded. He was never one to prescribe to a narrative. It's easy for us to do that. And in fact, he would, we're going to come to this, but he would criticize that as bad faith. He doesn't think that humans have an essence. He spent his life engaged in concrete conflicts that he thought were absolutely worthwhile. But in hindsight, we now have a narrative, right? He's sort of an object for us, and he succeeds. He succeeds as the writer that he dreamt of being when he was in his grandfather's study back in the 1910s. And not only that, he's been an active force in transforming what it means to be a French writer. Suddenly, the French writer is no longer concerned with beautiful letters, right? A French writer can be someone that is an active and powerful voice in social change. And that's the Sartre that he ends up becoming, and that's the Sartre that we have now. And that really, that kind of closes out his history. So that's Sartre's life and his literary development in a nutshell. So now I'm gonna shift gears here, and we're gonna look at a concrete aspect of his philosophy. So I'm gonna look at mauvaise foi, or bad faith, and this is a philosophical concept that he developed in Being and Nothingness, which he used a lot in his essays. And there's And he clarifies in the text I mentioned earlier, Truth and Existence. So, and I gotta ask for a little pardon here. This is admittedly the tougher part of the talk, where I have to somehow be clear without being vague, and then also be superficial enough without going too in depth, but without not really saying anything. So bear with me. So what is bad faith? We're going to start with an example. And so this is Sartre's example from Truth and Existence. Imagine a woman named T. Now, you're T's friend, and you're out with her at a cafe, a Parisian cafe. Let's have fun with this. And God's eye perspective now, T has tuberculosis. Hands down has tuberculosis. The friend doesn't necessarily know this, though. And, you and T are having coffee, and, she bends over to cough in her napkin, and there's blood in it. And, so this is, we'll say the 1940s, and it's obvious, like, honey, I think you've got tuberculosis. And T says, no, I'm not sick. And you're insistent. I think you're sick. And she won't have it. I'm not sick. And she's convinced of this. She does not think she has no illusions. She does not think she has tuberculosis, despite all the symptoms she has. Now imagine, you're presented with this, and basically at this point, all you can think in your head is, I think she's delusional. I don't know how she's lying to herself about this, but this girl is sick, but she won't have it. So this is what Sartre would call bad faith. This phenomena, this moment that I've tried to draw out here. That's bad faith. Okay, well and good. What the hell does that mean? And how does it work? We're going to spend the next 30 minutes trying to parse that out. So what's T's issue? We don't know yet. To answer the question of what T's bad faith is, what it amounts to, let's talk about what bad faith is not. So Sartre's philosophy, let's just encapsulate this real quick, because that's totally possible. Sartre has a very specific conception of human reality, human being, and that is that we are radically free. And what that means is we are condemned to always make choices. There is no sort of real determinism, no psychological determinism, no materialistic determinism that forces us wholesale down a specific pathway in life. We make those choices. We have to make these choices. And not only that, we are also lucid of these choices. So Sartre's theory of consciousness is such that not only are we conscious of things in the world, we're also conscious or aware, we're self-conscious that we are conscious. What that means for us is that when I make a choice, I'm also aware that I'm making that choice. And this move allows Sartre to undercut the sort of Hobbesian fear that, freedom just equals anarchy. Because he tacks on that because you're aware of your choices, you're also absolutely responsible for them. So his philosophy is one that says you are condemned to be free, and you're absolutely responsible for every free action that you do. And every action is free, so you're responsible for everything. That's a hell of a lot to put on a person's shoulders, but that's Sartre's view. And that's Sartre's existentialism. And that's why he says an existentialism is a humanism that famously existence precedes essence. His example, I believe, is a pair of scissors where, you have a pair of scissors and there's no illusions about what a pair of scissors is for. It's for cutting paper or cutting. When you take up a human, there's no predefined essence. The essence comes from the act of living. The essence comes from the act of choosing. It comes from the responsibility that you bear as a human being. And that's why I said earlier that Sartre's sort of narrative, his sort of essence and story, comes clear to us after his death, because he's no longer actively taking that up. So that's existentialism. So let's look at T now. Let's look at her bad faith from what little he gives us in Being in Nothingness. So about 100 pages in, Sartre discusses bad faith. And he's doing it to sort of unlock the deeper structures of consciousness. And he's using it as a stepping stone to continue this narrative. So he's brief. He's not vague, but dense and brief. And in about 20 pages, he offers his thoughts on bad faith. And in it, he essentially says that, immediately, he says that bad faith poses a problem, because in order for you to both be free and responsible and to be in bad faith, you have to know and not know that you're doing something, which is a contradiction. And he bites wholesale. He's fine with this. He's fine with the logical contradiction, the superficial contradiction of this. But what does this mean? That means that T must be aware that she has tuberculosis, and must also know that she doesn't, or must, believe that she does not have tuberculosis. The problem is that seems to be something that would undercut this whole project, this whole idea of bad faith. If I know that I'm lying to myself, I'm not lying to myself. I'm being facetious. I'm being facetious. I don't believe it. It doesn't have the sort of efficacy that Sartre sees in the phenomenon, right? That's not quite it. Something must be deeper, but how is that possible? He sort of tries to resolve this paradox, but the passages here are so dense that when philosophers, when thinkers try to confine themselves to describing in the analytical tradition, when they take up Sartre in what they call self-deception, it's just not enough. And same for other thinkers. It's not just analytical. It's just too dense. So you have to look to these other texts, because he doesn't resolve the problem, I think, sufficiently, of how do you know and not know P? How does T know that she has tuberculosis and also not know it? So that's where Being in Nothingness leaves us. So what can the text Truth and Existence do for us? This is a very slim volume, about 80 pages, and like I said, it was published after his death. And in it, his intention is a response to Heidegger's volume, Wesen der Wahrheit. And it's also his intention to spell out some of these sort of moral, ethical potholes or potholes in Being in Nothingness. Specifically, he's trying to address the lacking epistemology that is only sort of superficially touched on in Being in Nothingness. So he develops an epistemology, his worldview in Truth and Existence. So let's quickly take a sidestep before we can answer the question of T's self-deception, bad faith. Let's dive in a little bit into Sartre's epistemology here. In Being in Nothingness, to know, right, epistemology, is as simple as consciousness, human beings perceiving the world, perceiving objects. He uses this dualism, subject-object. Even though he doesn't really subscribe to it, he uses it quite heavily. That is knowledge. This ontological connection between my perception of the world is the foundation of knowledge. And it is also what guarantees my existence and the world's existence, is this interplay, this knowledge. Well and good, but hardly satisfying. He rounds this out in Truth and Existence a little. So what do we get here? We get a new conception of knowledge. And what that is that just like his position on choice, he extends it to knowing. We, as human beings, as the beings that we are, make conscientious choices of what we choose to know. What this means is that we make conscientious choices of what we choose to engage in, right? Literally, what do we see in the world? Perceive, not see. What do we perceive in the world? What do we take up? What do we transform? What do we sort of unfold across time, right? Like this lecture, for instance, has been months in the making, and the truth of it is my continual engagement, its realization here. I've chosen the truth of this lecture. So truth is a choice, and truth and validity is that presence. So the term in French is il y a. In German, it's Dasein, and in English, it's there is, or being there, right? So in Sartre's epistemology, validation, right? So what I mean by that is, how do I know that this pencil, this mechanical pencil is in front of me? How do I know that I'm giving this lecture? The truth of it, the validity of it is my presence before it. It is its presence before my consciousness. I put it there. So these objects, this world is in time and space because of my view on it. So that's truth and that's validity. I make it real. I make this real. In a way, you almost give it life, right? He's not an idealist, and he's particularly not a Berkeleyan idealist, but he does believe that when consciousness perceives the world, it pulls from what he uses the term, the night of being, very, very literary. This text is notes. It's not not fully fledged out, but he says, sort of very like Heidegger, right, that you draw being from the night, and that is truth. He says that humans, therefore, live in the truth, swim in the truth as fish do in water. We're continually surrounded by truth. But this also introduces the dialectic, if you will, of truth, which is untruth or ignorance. And this has to be in play. He has to flesh out a theory of ignorance, because that's the foundation on which truth is built, specifically as a choice. Otherwise, truth would sort of be deterministic, right? A human being, if he wasn't free, if he or she or they weren't free, life would be sort of dictated. There wouldn't be any sort of autonomous taking up in the world. So there has to be a choice alongside the choice of truth in the world of ignorance. For example, right now I'm trying to pursue philosophy academically. What have I forsaken in this project of becoming a philosopher, right? So much. I'm not going to be a construction worker anytime soon, although I'd probably enjoy it. I'm not going to be a bus driver. I'm not going to reveal that world. I'm not going to learn the truth of it. I'm not going to learn the truth of mathematics in as much detail as I would if I wanted to pursue mathematics. I'm actively choosing the life of a philosopher, while also actively choosing to be ignorant about an infinite amount of other things, possible worlds. So let's do a little digging into the French word. So ignorer, again, forgive my pronunciation, but ignorer is stronger than it is in English, or more dynamic, more loaded, if you will. There's the sort of superficial use of the term that we use, ignorance. I'm ignorant of a lot of things. I don't know much about childcare. I don't know what's happening. I don't know how much shopkeepers in Alexanderplatz in Berlin are making. I just don't know a lot of things, and that's okay. And that's a choice, but it's a little different. It's just genuine ignorance. There's no sort of moral charge in it yet. Then there's a second aspect of ignorer, and that is ignoring. So let's say you're at a supermarket and you're in the checkout line and your kid is going nutso because, there's a whatchamacallit or a Reese's and they have to have that candy. And you're trying to talk to the cash register person and you're ignoring your child. That's another way that ignoria can be used. And then there's a third way, which is most important for us, and that is to sort of actively, more strongly ignore, to neglect, to turn away from, to kind of cast away. And that is definitely the facet or whatever you want, the version of the ignoria that has most bearing for us. So what does this mean? That means that when we make choices, in a world, there is a realm of ignorance. There is a realm of being that's overshadowed, that we just don't choose to engage in, that we don't even know is there. There's also times where we're very lucidly ignoring things. So we're actually not even not aware of them, right? You're definitely absolutely aware of your child throwing a temper tantrum and embarrassing you in the supermarket. You're not turning away from it. And then there's this third description. So with these few things, so let's recap here. We've got a conception of human being, which is free and condemned to make choices and responsible for them. We have the idea of truth, which is presence, right? And actively taking up. So really dynamically, concretely in the world, doing things. And then there's ignorance, which is the sort of shadow side of that. And it's here that Sartre develops bad faith. It's here that he's finally able to put his finger on what is happening. So let's return to T. And see if, I can kind of clarify what I think is happening with her case of bad faith. And I do want to note, too, the question isn't for Sartre, and it never was, is bad faith real? As a phenomenologist, he's concerned first and foremost with finding a correct and convincing method for describing a phenomenon in the world. So he has no bones about the validity or the bad faith being real. The difficulty, and it's extremely difficult, and not just in bad faith, but in phenomenology in general, is writing in a clear and lucid and convincing way that really draws these out. And that's definitely, for me, is the difficulty of this portion, is speaking in a way that not so much convinces you about this phenomenon, but allows you to kind of put your finger on it when you, kind of engage in the world for your own self. So anyways, blah, blah, blah. What's going on with T? So again, we're back, let's say Le Domago, right? You're having a coffee, with T, and she's clearly sick. And you say something to her. And she says, that's what my doctor said that as well, but I'm not sick. I know I'm not sick. She's convinced. What's going on? So what I think is happening, and what I think Sartre is getting at, is that T is convinced that she does not have tuberculosis. And the reason why she's able to know that she has tuberculosis and not know that she has tuberculosis is because of her active choice of life in the world. So when she goes to the doctor's office and her doctor says to her, "You're sick," he introduces the possibility of a world where she's a tuberculosis patient. It's sitting there before her, not in all of its, fine details, right? She hasn't lived the life of a tuberculosis patient. And by what I mean by that is getting X-rays, going to the hospital, looking for, I don't think you'd get a lung transplant for this, but maybe, whatever kind of having tuberculosis as a patient entails, it's there sitting before her when her doctor says, "You're sick." She chooses to not engage with that. She turns away from that. She does not validate it. She does not take it up. She leaves that world outside of her. She leaves it in the veil or the night of being. She does not choose to draw it out. She does not choose to unveil it. Instead, she turns to a world that she lives where she doesn't have tuberculosis. What does this look like? She lives a life where she gets up like she used to at the same time. She gets her paper, she reads it. She holds her appointments with her friends. She goes to the cafe. She tries to do her afternoon walks. Engage with family members. Anything and everything that evidences that she's fine. This is her truth. This is her world. And that is not the world of someone with tuberculosis. Okay, that's fine, but we have a problem. She has symptoms. Okay, she has shortness of breath. She can't go upstairs. She can hardly walk with you anymore. And she's cut short periodically during your conversation at this cafe because she has to cough up blood in her napkin. Why doesn't that convince her? Why doesn't that say, hello, you're lying to yourself? And it's because of the relationship that she's chosen to put herself in with these symptoms. These symptoms are disconnected. Let's say, as a metaphor here, they're sort of chopped off from the body of their reality. So you present me with a handful of fingers and I'm not convinced that that's a human being. That was really morbid, I'm sorry, but that's kind of what's happening with her. These events, Sartre says, have the sort of relationship, an external relationship to her and her body and her understanding of it. And what I mean by is the coughing, the shortness of breath, that a cup has to a saucer. No sort of real dynamic taking up, right? These are just random, isolated events. They mean nothing to her. So they don't convince her. And they don't evidence a world that she knows where she's a tuberculosis patient. So this seems to suggest then that the paradox, so earlier I said we had the paradox of knowing and not knowing that she has tuberculosis. That's equivocating. We've suddenly modified what to know means. So for the purposes of this conversation, she's aware that she has tuberculosis, right? It kind of haunts her. And in fact, and this is the depth of her self-deception here that Sartre would criticize her with, and a hallmark of bad faith is that she's defined herself on this tuberculosis. She can't define herself as someone without having, so she tries to define herself as not having tuberculosis, and she can't do that without doing it on the foundation of having tuberculosis. Otherwise, her choice of herself would simply be absolutely ignorant in the first sense of the term of tuberculosis. It would have no bearing on her life. It means nothing to her, just as much as whatever collection of buttons in an airplane means for a pilot. It would have no bearing on her life. But now, the constant questions, the sort of random episodes of illness, these all haunt her. They spur her on to define herself in a way that is tuberculosis free. And that she does that in bad faith because she's delusional. She's avoiding the truth. And she's able to do that because we're condemned to make choices. And those choices are likewise condemned because they happen in time, because they happen in a concrete space, to be limited. And she's chosen to actively cut out the truth of her illness. And that is sort of the root of her bad faith. So that's bad faith in a nutshell. And that's definitely only one example. The phenomenon, if you will, is really quite dynamic. I've only used one example here. Sartre has quite a few, and they're wonderful. Famously, he's got the waiter. I'm sure a lot of you know about the waiter, who is just so sort of into his role as a waiter at this cafe that everything is sort of like, his movements are so like kind of fudged up and obsequious, right? They're a little too much, a little sticky, a little weird. It's like, all right, bud, calm down. And that's because this person in bad faith is convinced that he can be and is no other than a waiter. He declines his freedom. He denies his freedom and wholesale adapts himself to this view of I'm this object waiter thing. That's another example of bad faith. Another great one is narcissism. So someone who is so sort of taken up with themselves, maybe in terms of beauty or intelligence or financial economic power, they're so convinced that they're so great and have so much to offer the world that in bad faith they can't even see the consequence of their actions. That's a really easy one. So these are other examples of bad faith. And I just wanted to throw those out there to maybe kind of like color the palette a little bit more deeply. So that kind of brings us to the conclusion of Sartre's Life and Thought, and hopefully a somewhat convincing or lucid enough description of some of his philosophy, bad faith. Thank you.